In 1349, a 36-year-old Florentine man named Giovanni Boccaccio started work on what he believed was his masterpiece, a collection of novellas called the Decameron. In the book, a small group of young people, 7 women and 3 men, flee from Florence to the rural outskirts of the city. To pass the time, each member of the party takes a turn telling a story to amuse the rest of the group. The group isn't just in the rural region of Fiesole to enjoy a break from city life, however, but rather to escape the plague. Boccaccio, likely writing from his own experience living in the city when the deadly disease hit in 1348, started the book by describing the situation the plague caused in Florence. People, both rich and poor, were confined to their homes without any hope of friends or physicians coming to their aid. Boccaccio writes, quote, "Being confined to their own parts of the city, they fell ill in their thousands, and since they had no one to assist them or to attend to their needs, they inevitably perished almost without exception. Many dropped dead in the open streets, both by day and night, and whilst a great many others, though dying in their own houses, drew their neighbors' attention to the fact more by the smell of their rotting corpses than by any other means. And what with these and the others who were dying all over the city, bodies were here, there, and everywhere."
After a dead body was discovered, Boccaccio wrote, it was taken out of the house and simply left on the front doorstep until local men with a bier, which is sort of a flat cart, could come and take the body away. Quote, "It was by no means rare for more than one of these biers to be seen with 2 or 3 bodies upon them at a time. On the contrary, many were seen to contain a husband and wife, 2 or 3 brothers and sisters, a father and son, or some other pair of close relatives. At times it happened that 2 priests would be on their way to bury someone, holding a cross before them, only to find that bearers carrying 3 or 4 additional. Biers would fall in behind them, so that whereas the priests had thought they had only 1 burial to attend to, they in fact had 6 or 7, and sometimes more."
What Boccaccio was describing wasn't just any epidemic. It was the Black Death, the virulent disease that had made its way from the lands of the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean ports of the Italian peninsula. The disease rampaged around Europe between 1347 and 1353, killing by some estimates as many as 60% of the British Isles and European continent. As we see in Boccaccio's descriptions of Florence during the first wave of the plague, the rate of death was overwhelming to graveyards and to priests performing funerals, yes, but it was also overwhelming to medicine, to social systems, and to religious structures. Families were thrown into chaos, the Catholic Church faced dissension in its ranks, and townships struggled to provide services and control infection. The sheer ubiquity of death even fostered an artistic genre, the danse macabre, which reminded young and old, rich and poor, healthy and sick alike, that all would be made equal in death. For this episode in our death series, what better topic than the Black Death itself? The Black Death was an outbreak of what historians and doctors now call the bubonic plague, a zoonotic disease caused by bacteria transferred through the mouthparts of fleas. And zoonotic just means that it's a disease that originates in animals and is shared with humans. But no one knew that, right? Knew that that was what caused the Black Death until the end of the 19th century. After Louis Pasteur's breakthrough disproving of the miasma theory and Robert Koch's innovation in bacteriology in the mid to late 19th century, it was suddenly possible for scientists to identify the cause of diseases. There had been little outbreaks of the plague, particularly in Asia, throughout the 19th century. But in 1894, there was a serious epidemic in Canton, a region in China. Something like 50,000 to 100,000 people died during the epidemic, which was closely followed by another epidemic in British-held Hong Kong. Terrified that the plague would spread, European and Japanese doctors went to Hong Kong to study the disease.
In June 1894, Alexander Yersin, a French bacteriologist, and Kitasado Shibasaburo, a Japanese bacteriologist, traveled to Hong Kong to study the disease. There had been suspicion about the fact that there had been a ton of dead black rats in Hong Kong in recent months, and Yersin and Shibasaburo suspected it might be connected to the outbreak. Within just a few weeks, they identified bacteria in both the blood of plague sufferers and in dead rats. While both scientists were involved in its discovery, the bacterium was ultimately named for Yersin, Yersinia pestis. It was also Yersin who connected the dead rats to the bacteria causing the plague in humans, saying, quote, "It is probably that the rats constitute the principal vehicle." Identifying the bacteria was a huge breakthrough, but it didn't actually solve the mystery of how the bacteria traveled from rat to human. Did it travel through the air, like we know that the hantavirus does today? In 1903, during another outbreak in Bombay, a British entomologist named Glenn Liston observed that many of the plague patients in a certain overcrowded apartment building had fleas. But they weren't people fleas. They were a particular kind of flea that only liked black rats. In 1905, in reaction to the outbreak in India, the British government put together the Indian Plague Commission, which was tasked with determining how the disease was spread, and Glenn Liston joined it.
Liston's place on the commission likely influenced just how much emphasis the group placed on investigating the role the flea had in this whole thing. One of the first things they discovered was that the bacteremia, or the level of bacteria in someone's blood, of people was small, which made it really unlikely that fleas were carrying the disease from person to person. On the other hand, they found that bacteremia in rats was super high, meaning that it must be moving from rat to flea to person. But how exactly was it doing that? At first, the commission suspected that it transmitted plague in the same way that lice transmitted the typhus virus. To make a long, kind of gross story short, the typhus virus passed through the body of lice and was excreted into its poop. So when someone scratched at an itch from a louse bite, they ended up scratching the poop into the bite wound, entering the virus into their bloodstream. But yeah, it was super gross. But the researchers found that while Yersinia pestis survived the journey through the flea's digestive system, it wasn't strong enough to do any harm after it was pooped out. Then they thought that maybe it was getting stuck on the flea's proboscis, the little, needly thing that bites you, right? Kind of like a mosquito. But the bacteria were so large that they didn't get stuck, like they couldn't get stuck on there. Eventually, with very close study of flea digestive systems, the commission determined that what was happening was that a flea would drink blood from a rat, filling up its stomach, and yes, scientists, I know that it's not called a stomach, I'm just trying to make this simpler, which would then be closed by a little flap. The flap keeps all that blood in the flea's tummy. Otherwise, it would all be shoved back out because the tummy is essentially under pressure, right? But the bacteria in the blood reproduce so quickly that it creates a kind of blockage. So later, when the flea goes to feed again, let's say this time on a human, it's forced to regurgitate just a little bit of that blockage in order to suck up more blood, which of course injects the bacteria and starts the infection. April's really grossed out right now.
So once it's in your bloodstream, the bacillus reproduces extremely rapidly, making the immune system just go haywire. Typically, the body would attempt to neutralize and isolate the germ into the lymphatic system, but the bacillus overwhelms the system, causing blood poisoning, which then causes a rapid onset high fever. As the body tries to isolate the germ into the lymph nodes, the nodes swell and swell and swell, causing what are called buboes, or extremely swollen lymph nodes. Blood poisoning, which then causes a rapid onset high fever. As the body tries to isolate the germ into the lymph nodes, the nodes swell and swell and swell, causing what are called buboes, or extremely swollen lymph nodes. And that's why it's called the bubonic plague.
See?
These buboes are usually on the groin, but can also be in the armpits or the neck, depending on where the flea bites you.
Right, so it's gonna swell closest to the bite site. And typically, I think probably because they're fleas and they're not making it all the way up to your upper body, they are really low. Those buboes are usually right in your groin.
It's possible that if the lymphatic system is energetic enough, it can control the infection. But more often, the germ overloads the system. As your body tries to fight the infection, you get a raging fever, become increasingly weak, and generally become dehydrated and delirious. Within a couple of days, the person dies of septicemia. Depending on your health at the time of infection and your age, etc., without really strong antibiotics, you would typically die in about 7 to 10 days. This variant, the bubonic plague, is not all that contagious because it's not passed from person to person. For instance, it's not like the flu being passed as you cough, or like Ebola passed through bodily fluids. Instead, it's almost always spread through the flea.
It is possible for it to spread from human to human, but only under very certain situations. So like you'd have to come into direct contact with blood or pus. And the only people really who would be doing that is maybe a doctor who, say, tried to lance a bubo or something like that, because it's not a disease that causes bleeding. Like you're not coughing up blood, or like Ebola causes lots of bleeding and bodily fluids. This is not a disease that really does that. So the disease is really being spread from flea bites, not from interpersonal contact, right?
So the bubonic plague is the most common variant, but it can manifest in other ways. So septicemic plague occurs when the amount of bacteria delivered by the flea is particularly large, and it is able to multiply so quickly that it overloads the system, killing a patient within just a couple of days, without the time to develop buboes. Pneumonic plague occurs when the bacteria happens to collect in the lungs, where the bacillus infects the lung tissue, and like septicemic plague, it kills very rapidly. Pneumonic plague is highly contagious because it causes the victim to cough a lot, spreading the disease as it becomes airborne. But in most cases, it doesn't actually spread the disease much because the person is made so sick so quickly that they just don't have much opportunity to spread the disease.
They die so fast, right?
And just to be clear, these are all the same bacteria, the Yersinia pestis, but just different ways that it affects your body.
Yeah, like different strains, sort of. So how do we know that the Black Death was this particular disease? Well,
So anyway, now that we know what the plague is and how it spreads, we can finally start to explore the history of how bacteria-laden fleas cause those mass graves in places like Florence. The outbreak that historians now call the Black Death began its rampage across Europe in 1347. But as scientists have now proved, it existed for centuries before that. The first plague had serious ramifications. The population decrease and economic decline seriously harmed the strength of the Byzantine Empire, with particular effect on the army. Formerly occupied Byzantine territories like the Baltics and Italy were invaded and occupied, the Baltics by the Slavs and Italy by the Germanic Lombards. In North Africa, it meant that Muslim Arabs' armies seized Byzantine land in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Armenia, eventually invading into the Mediterranean, taking most of Spain and making it all the way into France. But then the plague seemed to just disappear. There were other plagues. Plague was a term that medieval people applied to all sorts of things, from insects to diseases, but none that appeared to be chalked up to Yersinia pestis. So what made it come back in the mid-1300s? Well, no one's completely sure.
right, they're debating it.
Yeah.
Because that's what people do about the Black Death.
But here's one theory that lots of historians buy into. The plague existed naturally in wild rodents in particular regions, specifically in the American Southwest and in southern Russia.
It still exists in the American Southwest, by the way. So be careful hanging out with rodents in, the desert.
Yes, as one is likely to do.
Although we could treat you with strong antibiotics now, though.
And you'd be all right. Yeah. The plague that hit Europe likely originated somewhere in southern Russia, but some historians say it was probably actually Manchurian or Mongolian steppes in northeast China, while others say it was actually the Yunnan or Burma, or what was Myanmar, in southern China region. Other folks say it couldn't have originated in China at all, and actually probably came from Russia. Historian Ulla Benedictau, who has written one of the most insanely detailed synthetic histories of the Black Death, dismisses the China theory and instead argues that it most likely originated in the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea in the land of the Mongol Khanate known as the Golden Horde. Anyway, wherever it originated, unless it was disturbed, that wild rodent disease would just sort of hang out in those wild rodents and never travel. But something happened to transfer the flea from wild rodents to commensal black rats.
So, in case you're not aware, the term commensal refers to rodents that live in conjunction with humans. So, like the mice that live in your house, the rats that live in your barn, those are commensal rodents. Whereas, like field mice or like what are the voles? Those are non-commensals because they don't live basically almost in a parasite-like relationship with humans. Does that make sense?
Yes.
They're called commensals.
Ew. It could have been armies traveling through the region, bringing rats with them, or it could have been traveling merchants. There just aren't written records from the era or area, so it's just really guesswork at this juncture.
Right. One theory that does come down from the written record, and it's a theory that you may have heard before, is that the plague was transmitted from the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe through biological warfare. One theory that does come down from the written record, and it's a theory that you may have heard before, is that the plague was transmitted from the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe through biological warfare. Italian merchants recorded that Jonabeg, a warrior from the Kipchak Khanate, aka the Golden Horde, flung plague-infested corpses into the Crimean port city of Kaffa, and fleeing Genoese merchants accidentally then brought the disease back to the Italian peninsula with them. While it's definitely possible that this thing happened, Ulla Benedictau points out that the plague isn't really spread through contact with infected bodies. It's spread by the flea. And while the bodies might have had fleas on them, it's not likely that the number of fleas on those dead bodies could have had a big impact. But even more damning is that medieval people didn't know anything about bacteriology. So instead, they believed that the disease, or that disease in general, was spread by miasmas, or bad smells. This is going to be a major theme for the rest of the episode. So in order to believe that they were spreading the disease by using corpses and flinging them over the gates, they would have had to keep those dead bodies around until they got nice and decomposed and stinky, which seems like a great way to give yourself the plague, right? If you're like just keeping dead infected bodies just sitting around until they're nice and stinky and then touching them and, you know, loading them onto catapults, like it just seems really unlikely that they would think that this was a great plan. That's not to say that it never happened. More specifically, it's to say that that didn't spread the plague.